is science and its role in responding to the infodemic. But before we start our session, a couple of house rules in here, please, that I want to remind the audience that this particular session is under the Chatham House rules, which means that you will not be able to live tweet attributed to any of the speakers. Please keep a note of it. Do not live tweet. Thank you so much. We will be taking all questions in the end of the session, and whatever question that you have, please feel free to type it in the Hopin chat box, and our panel is going to take the questions after their session. Our first panel of esteemed scientists and medical professionals will basically discuss today the science and its role in responding to the infodemic. So I'll just take a couple of minutes in introducing our esteemed panel. Dr. Arash Rashidian is the Director of Science, Information and Dissemination at the World Health Organization's Eastern Mediterranean Regional Office and the Executive Editor of the Eastern Mediterranean Health Journal. He will moderate the session for us today. He joined WHO from his position as Professor of Health Policy and Deputy Chancellor, Tehran University of Medical Sciences. His previous positions include Founding Director of National Institute of Health Research in Iran and Senior Academic and Honorary positions in UK, Pakistan, and Iran. Thank you so much, Dr. Arash, for joining us today. Our speakers for this session are Dr. Rosamund Lewis, who's Health Sciences Lead Infodemic Management at WHO. A public health physician, Dr. Rosamund has worked with the Government of Canada and other public health agencies in emergency preparedness, immunization, and disease control. She holds a fellowship in public health and preventive medicine and a master's degree in epidemiology and biostatistics. Thank you, Dr. Rosamund, again for joining us for the Misinformation in Medicine Summit. Dr. Philip J. Rosenthal is an infectious disease physician and malaria specialist at the University of California, San Francisco, and also the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. Dr. Rosenthal completed his residency at the University of Michigan and subsequently joined the University of California, San Francisco as a postdoctoral fellow in medicine. Thank you, Dr. Philip. Thank you again. Dr. Sumaya Sheikh is the next speaker for this session. She's a neuroscientist at Linköping University Hospital in Sweden and the founding editor for Alt News Science India, a fact-checking platform for medical misinformation. She's also a consultant and researcher on security, terrorism, and misinformation. In 2019, she co-authored India Misinformed, the true story, in which she elaborated the patterns of misinformation. Sumaya holds a PhD in medicine from the University of Sydney in Australia. Thank you, Sumaya. Thank you for being here today. Our next speaker for this session is Dr. Jaya Sridhar, is adjunct professor at the Asian College of Journalism in Chennai and has previously worked with UNICEF, UNAIDS, WHO, and the National AIDS Control Organization. Dr. Jaya Sridhar holds a medical degree from the University of Chennai. She currently consults with Internews Network on COVID-19 and translational science. We welcome our esteemed panel, and I, with that, now hand it over to you, Dr. Arash. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today.
Many thanks, Surbi, for your nice introduction and also opening the scene for the discussion. Welcome and hello again to the panelists. Welcome and hello to all colleagues and friends and from around the world who are with us and seeing this session. So obviously the time is limited and we want to go directly to the discussion that we have. So for that one, I'm going to invite my colleague, Dr. Rosamund Lewis. She's going to set the scene, the topics that we are going to cover from different directions. And then after that, we follow with the different speakers as we explain the process, the problems and the challenges, as well as the solutions to potential solutions to the issue of misinformation and infodemic. Rosamund, over to you.
Thank you very much, Arash. It's quite a pleasure to be here. It's really a tremendous opportunity for us all to be discussing what scientists, what we as public health professionals and scientists can do to manage the abundance of information that's accompanying this pandemic. So, of course, there's good information, but there's also misinformation. And what is our role as scientists and public health professionals in this? Of course, there's been an extraordinary explosion of research in science, but also in epidemiology, virology, all the sciences, virology, clinical care, clinical management, and so many other areas of work. And it's really difficult for us to follow even the science of it. So how can we support others who are not scientists to know how to consume this abundance of information? So one of the things that we can talk about is what is the life cycle of a science project, a research project. So there's obviously the design, the beginning, the conception of the project, the design, the selection of participants or the study methods, the sample size. Is it the right kind of study? Has it been through ethics review? What are the funding decisions associated with that? How is it determined what is funded, what is not funded, and so on? So there's the whole design of the research project or a study or an epidemiological review. And how can that be done well? Of course, there are methods and standards. Also, where can it go wrong? Then after that, once the science is completed, it has to go through a curation process. So the curation of science involves also a whole range of steps, including peer review. Now we have preprint archives, meta-archives, for example, preprint servers that are already putting information out there without peer review. So what does that mean? These articles are sometimes being picked up in social media without explanation, without context, and what does that mean? So the role of the editors, the journals are really important here, and we look forward to hearing from our speakers on that point. And then finally, we need to also take all these results that are put out in the public domain, and as scientists, we think we're done. We've published, we're good. That's it, over to someone else. But in fact, really, we also have a responsibility. So how do we support the public health professionals to communicate science? And how do we also support the appropriate and adequate and timely communication of information to the general public? So if we look at all these different stages that research needs to go through, there are many challenges at each stage. And it is incumbent upon us as scientists and public health professionals to also figure out what are some solutions? What are some ways in which we can mitigate the risks of this abundance of information? Thanks.
Many thanks, Rosamund. I mean, that was very clearly said and covered the cycle in the process. And you very rightly refer to the role that the journals have. And very, relevant here. I would like to invite Dr. Philip Rosenthal. He's the chief editor of a major related journal that is focusing on issues of infectious diseases. And I'm sure he's been seeing a lot of submissions and processes related, but he's also looking at what's happening in that process. So from that perspective, of a peer review academic journal, how do you see the problem, Phil? How do you think we can do better in response, and what can be done? Over to you.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm coming really from two perspectives. I am a researcher myself. I write lots of papers, scientific papers, though my research is not in COVID, it's in malaria, actually. But I also, for the last 6 years, I've been editor, as you heard, of a journal, the American Journal of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, which has a broad mandate to publish in mostly clinical tropical medicine and public health. So actually, COVID is very relevant for us. We've received hundreds of submissions on the subject and published now almost 200 papers on all different aspects of COVID. The role of journals seems pretty straightforward. We publish scientific information after peer review. True scientific fraud is probably very uncommon, and that's somewhat of a different subject, I think, than our main area of attention today. But I think it's important to understand that even peer review is a very imperfect process, especially for a relatively small journal like ours. We are a society journal. We're the journal for the American Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. We have actually one full-time employee. I am a part-time editor. I'm still, that's my day job is as a researcher and a clinician at a medical school. And our reviewers and our other editors are all people who are taking care of their roles just as a service to the community. So it should be understood that misinformation, either accidentally, and most typically in a journal it would be accidental, or perhaps occasionally due to real fraud, can slip through relatively easily. So even at the level of peer-reviewed publications, one must be a bit careful. The literature is, I'm sure you all know, the literature is very messy, and it's a little hard to be sure of anything. And even of course, publications in the most prestigious, biggest, best funded medical journals still can be suspect at times. And of course, there have been very good examples of that through the years. It's also, for a journal, it's also difficult to communicate scientific information to the general public. And of course, it's very common that information that's pretty straightforward to the scientific community can quite easily be misconstrued more generally. And of course, it's the role of journalists to do that difficult job of taking the stuff that scientists talk about, sometimes in not so clear manner, and turning it into information that can be understood. And this has been a remarkable year for all of us, of course. But one thing remarkable to me is that my main source of information is not medical journals. It's the general press. I will say my main medical journal is the New York Times, and I learn of things in the general press well before it makes its way through peer review and the scientific literature. That's dangerous, but it's the way it is with a fast-moving situation such as COVID-19. And just the last few weeks, we've all learned about the initial efficacy of a few vaccines and vaccine trials. It's very exciting, but we learned that without anything approaching peer review. We learned that from press releases from companies, and then I learned it from newspaper articles. So that's a dangerous situation, but on the other hand, it is the way it is, and it's also an opportunity because we learn information so quickly. But the challenge is within that to distinguish high quality scientific information and lower quality information, and even, of course, fraudulent information, true misinformation. And that's the subject, and I'll be happy to discuss that further. Thank you.
Many thanks, Phil. I mean, very like you said, and also you put the perspective of when the science we are dealing, when we make, by that I mean the global community making some policy decisions, sometimes there is a science that is still not achieved all the stages required normally. So by that I move to another scientist in our panel, Dr. Sumaya Sheikh, who is a scientist herself, but also she's dealing with the issue of fact-checking about the science related to COVID, trying to deal with the issue of misinformation. So that's another angle that is really important in this discussion that we are having. So we would like to hear from you, Sumaya. How do you see the problem, and what do you think is happening? What can be done better from now on?
Great, thank you, Arash, and thank you everyone for having me here. I would just elaborate on what Dr. Rosenthal pointed out. I think it's absolutely a great job of the editors and people who put together information, the scientists, and release that information. And from there onwards, it goes to the health professionals who actually communicate that to the general public. Now, because there is this pass, like there's a system in the middle, not just of the peer review, but also of the health professionals who perhaps read or understand information from perhaps credible resources, such as the journals or a credible newspaper like the New York Times or the Atlantic, which does a lot of good science journalism. But the majority of the general public who do not have access to or resources to have access to these elite publications or even the journals rely very much on their peers on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp, and all these other places. YouTube in particular is very popular to look for cures just simple Google searches all the time. And we've seen our data says that Google searches have increased tremendously with a lot of the I would say quackery type remedies, lemon and water and bleach, and we know that in Iran a couple of people died because of that. So they rely on social media and then look for information by themselves, and they don't know where to go. They don't know what's a credible website to go, and that's why we come in as fact checkers. We look at the science, we look at the credibility of the science in published and non-published articles, and we don't just look at a journal if it's published in a good journal, for example, or if it's published by somebody who is a real scientist or not. Sometimes you can have bad data published in average journals, and that could be used and cross-referenced to kind of amplify the end story of whether something's working or not. So a simple example was hydroxychloroquine. You had to look at the data, you had to actually analyze what was going on to understand whether a drug is really being effective or not. But as a matter of fact, many people, especially the people who have the loudest voice on social media, including Trump, reported on the hydroxychloroquine drug that is super effective, and everybody jumped on it. So as a result, if you don't have the public health professional in the middle who is actually going to prescribe those drugs, people will assume that this is something to be taken for prevention as well as cure. And then you have a lot of people consuming that. Some people died with cardiotoxicity because they do not know how to administer those drugs in particular. So as fact checkers, I think it is important that people rely on scientists and on places that do fact checking, specifically using the science, such as we do. People should rely on credible sources on the social media as well. So they should follow scientists, they should follow places like the New York Times and the Atlantic. So, but majority of the people don't have the access to this information, and that could be extremely tricky, specifically in a place where even journals, I would agree that with Dr. Rosenthal that true fraud doesn't really exist. There's a lot of process in place, but in a lot of places, there are traditional medicines that have been pushed out, including China and India, and elsewhere, that does become a matter of problem because it's coming from the government institutes and the government bodies without credible research. It does become an issue where common people are consuming them. And then the journalists, the local journalists, not the New York Times ones, the local journalists can amplify that information and in an exaggerated way to sell a story that points to a magic cure, for example. And then that gets promoted on social media and WhatsApp and those places, specifically YouTube and WhatsApp. So specifically speaking to regional alternative options, a lot of people do have problems, consuming that information and, understanding what is right versus wrong, and understanding what's the process of research. As Dr. Roseman-Lewis pointed out, there is a gold standard. There's a process that people follow, ethical standards, biases, blinding, and most of the regular people don't know about it. And this is where we come into the picture, where we, in a way, remove the wheat from the chaff and tell you that this is what you want to consume in a very simple language, and tell you that, whether something is working or not working, and what to believe and what not to believe. So I think it's really important to have those possibilities where scientists can do these type of fact checkings, because there are journalists who are not trained to do science or understand them, but then there are people like us. So I think not just university, we did this pro bono for a long time until we started, getting funding to do what we're supposed to do. So I think all in all, I just started this as something that was required for the need, and this is like 3 years before the pandemic had occurred. So even then, we thought that this is the hour of the need, because people don't really understand science, and in some ways we're actually going backwards. A lot in Europe, especially, we were seeing more cases of measles for something that was preventable. Was something that we had the vaccine. I think that 2 years ago, there was more than 1,000 people, 1,000 kids who died just because of measles. There were more anti-vaxxers in the US than we'd ever known. So I think it's really important that scientists start communicating in a simple way, come out of the bubble, come out of the elite system, and in a very simple way, start talking to people that enables people and make them easier to understand and consume the science.
Many thanks. I mean, that was very elaborate, and you referred to a lot of issues, which also, I mean, brought further angles into it. I mean, if I want to summarize part of the issue that, I mean, the three of you have highlighted so far is the issue of the importance of that critical thinking and critical appraisal, that you can check the science on that. So by that, I go to another scientist who is with us, Dr. Jaya Sridhar, and she, if I can describe you correctly, I mean, you have two hats. You are a scientist, but you are also an academic journalist yourself. So you are seeing the issue from the sort of journalism perspective as a professional person in that perspective, but also from the medical science part of it, which is very important. So how do you see the challenge, the problem, and what do you think can be done for it further?
I prefer to refer to myself as a medical person and as a communicator and journalist rather than a scientist per se. However, thank you for Dr. Rashidian and Dr. Sumaya and Dr. Rosamund and Dr. Philip for flagging up all those keynotes, that are related to the current infodemic that we find ourselves in. And if I may be allowed to say something, I think that the roots of this current infodemic extend way back. They were there before COVID. Only thing we didn't sense the impact of misinformation, disinformation, misunderstanding, or the gossip that's going around on social media. We didn't see this level of engagement across so many domains that we're seeing now, but it was happening at a very low level. And if I may be permitted to call it an endemic of misinformation and dissemination, I hope you'll permit me that. I think what's different in the current scenario is the pressure caused by millions of infections and deaths added to the speed at which it's happening. And the third major issue I think we're all very unfamiliar with is the porosity between the domains of science and media and the lay public, who are all in various levels of understanding. The public isn't a monolithic, something monolithic. They have varying levels of understanding and engagement. And I think the membranes between all these different domains have become so porous that the information is filtering through at varying rates with absolutely no curation whatsoever. And that's some of the roots of the problem lie there. So nowadays, what we're seeing is science stripped naked in a way. Even minor adverse events in vaccine trials are making it to the front pages. Every little glitch, every little mistake is amplified beyond belief. And that's a very, very uncomfortable and new situation for scientists to find themselves in. And I don't think that that's really fair. But given the current information era that we live in, this is something that we have to come to terms with, and we have to work out solutions to sort of address where we can plug the porosity and where we should allow democratic and transparent exchange of information among all of these domains. And I think the COVID pandemic is presenting us with a great opportunity to promote a better understanding among the public of how science works. Science moves at its own pace. It asks more questions than gives answers, contrary to popular public opinion, which thinks that science has all the answers. It doesn't. It raises more questions than it can answer. And that's the beauty of science. It builds on itself. And this is a great opportunity to showcase that for the public and to understand that scientists don't have all the answers. And it's a great opportunity to tell those sections of the media who are new to health journalism that you can't get sensational headlines just from one little, a preprint study or something. It just doesn't deserve that kind of attention. So from long years of working in that twilight zone, or that mid-space, if you may, that space between science and the media, we deal on a daily basis with the challenge of how to translate the beautiful thing that's science and take it in a way through the media to help them interpret and understand it, and then help the media convey that understanding to the public. And it's a long journey. It's a very, very difficult journey. And I think right now, we need to come up with ways in which we can step up to the board and take joint epistemic responsibility. I think that's really key, that scientists and the media, who are the main purveyors of information to the larger audiences, we need to take joint epistemic responsibility for the kind of information that is shared. And that's really important. And I don't think we can do it the traditional old way, where a scientist comes out with a research study and it's peer reviewed, goes into the publication,
and then there's a press conference with the media, and then you're hoping against hope that the media gets it right, and then you see yourself misquoted the next day. I think those old traditional ways are not going to work because the science is coming out too fast. It's ill-prepared, ill-digested, and ill-communicated from the scientists themselves. I think we're major purveyors of misinformation here. And then it's going through the media, and then it's reaching the audience, which is relating it to it in different ways. So I really think we need to come up with a solution as to what kinds of checks and balances need to come into the system. And as I said, what are we going to plug and what are we going to keep transparent, and work very hard right from the beginning at something that we just didn't bother about before, which is to develop a greater understanding in the public about how science works. I think that's the opportunity we have now, and I hope we don't waste it, because the next pandemic will probably just be around the corner. Thank you.
Many thanks indeed. And I would like to, you mentioned several very important points. One of them I would like to highlight further, the issue of that you said this problem is not new. It existed. And the fact that we are dealing with a bigger threat has resulted in, we see the problem further and amplified. And it's not just, for example, the vaccination issue that we had it as a problem for several years now, but now it's vaccination, it's treatment, it's prevention, it's policy making, all of those together, coming together and bring that. So I would like to also take some of the discussion further from my side. And so my role, I'm working in a journal for the WHO. I'm also Director of Science, Information and Dissemination in the region that is 22 countries, it's the Mediterranean region. And within that, for response to the pandemic, COVID, we have a committee that it's a policy-making committee at WHO level. And I lead the issue of knowledge management and research within that committee. So I'm dealing with this question from that regional perspective quite a lot. First of all, bringing the science to the policy-making processes inside the WHO, but also looking how the science is working and how it's being distributed and how science that WHO is advocating being received and being used in policy-making. And we see big problems. Some of them refer to what we heard before. The issue of the abundance of studies that are coming as science. Many of them are not meeting the minimum standards. But then some problems that you think of, these are also about the research governance itself that might become part of the challenge. So as an example, a very simple example that might resonate to our audience very well, globally, not just in special specialties. The issue is that, so we know more or less that, for example, honey has some anti-cough characteristics. So it has been known, it has been studied, etc. So then obviously in COVID-19, one of the symptoms is coughing. But you don't expect that you see a randomized controlled trial of 1,000 patients testing honey on COVID patients. And if you see that, there is a problem, because that's a randomized controlled trial. It has ethical approval. It's going on. So, why a study like this coming forward? Or on the other hand, so let's say, the first 2 months of COVID, we weren't sure with what sort of problem as a disease we are dealing with. So we were hoping that we can find cure medicines or miracle medicines. So then obviously you can justify a small sample size studies in the first couple of months of the problem. But we are still seeing that very small studies being registered and going ahead, while we know that you need few thousands of patients, if anything, to be able to say whether a medicine is going to be helpful or not. And so if that gets clearance and goes ahead, that becomes part of the problem, that becomes part of the issue. So the issue of research governance, so the science part is also need to bring all of those issues together more strongly and sort of take it forward. And then we see abuse. I know the issue of fraud was rightly mentioned by Phil and Sumaya, and I agree that it's not a major issue. It's not the blatant fraud, but the misuse of science is, we see that. For example, there is a sort of a medicine sort of has been proposed with a hypothesis. Let's say it's a sort of reasonable hypothesis. That means you have enough doubt to justify research is needed. So you get ethical clearance, you start on that sort of thing, and then it goes out to the public as if that it is ethically cleared to be used, rather than ethically clear that I have a question for it. So it's part of it is about also journalism understanding, as was mentioned before. So So Maya referred to that quite a lot. So to be able to distinguish, but also about those people who are behind it. So there are motives that may not be the correct motives there. And then on the other hand, how the science process itself can help the issue. I mean, so for example, I would give another example because I saw it on the chat box, and then refer to Rosamund I mean, she will give us some questions that we can take forward from the audience. So one of the things that we are very, very familiar is the sort of systematic reviews of evidence. So several studies, you put them together, and then meta-analysis. So within those methods, there is also a method that you get individual patient data from other studies. So individual patient data meta-analysis, so that you lump them all together as if you have a larger study, and you get a lot of results. To be able to do that, you need science sharing working really well. And we see very good examples of that happening under COVID that probably wasn't very common previously, but there is more to be done. And if those sharing are not happening, so then the science response might become delayed in areas that may not be warranted. And so those issues of, I mean, interpretation and understanding at the same time as the processes and governance all together will help science to do the job better, but also the public to trust the science more, and the policymakers make the right decision. Because, as I mean, Jaya, you mentioned that early on, I mean, so the public is not monolithic. Also, the scientists are not monolithic either. Some of the claims or some of the decisions that policymakers have made, there are some people that are called scientists that are behind those issues. So they could be part of that issue of some of the challenges coming forward. So by that, I hand over to my colleague, Rosamund. And so, Rosamund, what is your selection of questions for us to take forward?
Well, thank you. We have quite a few coming through here. If we perhaps turn our attention to what are some of the solutions and risk mitigation efforts we can put in place. I'll bring forward a couple of questions here. So one, sorry, the writer is not identified, but one of our audience has asked us, how does one call out problematic study methods in certain health-related research studies? Is there a way to identify and call out, maybe it's a strong word because it implies blaming but really I think, how do we identify problematic research methods?
I can actually
the study is adapted.
Okay, so I mean, if you allow, Sumaya, I invite Phil first and then you after. So, and
Sure.
The intention is we get more questions.
Absolutely.
So please try to limit it in 1 minute. So Phil, go ahead, please, followed by Sumaya.
Sure. Of course, peer review is designed to ferret out problems with methodology, and it works fairly well. But again, as I said, peer review is an inexact process. Typically 2, 3, maybe 4 reviewers will evaluate a study, and they don't all have the same expertise. And so maybe only one of those reviewers is truly qualified to seriously critique the methodology, and maybe they'll miss something. So that works fairly well, but problem studies can get through. Beyond that, when information is disseminated publicly, I think the typical process is to ask experts about it. But what's an expert? So the quality of that varies also, and so I think it's important to be very critical of who is telling the story. Scientific literature is pretty good quality, but somewhat variable, and be cautious about who is interpreting the science, speaking publicly.
Thank you. Sumaya, please.
Yeah, because we exactly do that. We basically do call out the bad science, and calling out, it doesn't mean blaming the person, but it does actually mean in a way, because since we've been doing fact checking for this long, there has been instances where there is a recognition in social media and everywhere else that you cannot get away by saying whatever you like just for the sake of amplification on social media. And mind you, there will be a lot of the times when the person who's propagating information knows that this is false, but the role of social media companies like YouTube and Google and a lot of these Twitter and Facebook comes into the fact where they actually look into monetization of content. And when that happens, and I know some companies did take a lot of information down, and they also reduced monetization or removed monetization for pandemic-related problems. But I think there's a strategy in which these guys approach, finding out what is medical misinformation and what is not. Now, a fact checker like me, who is a scientist and does this on the side, cannot go to every video on YouTube and tell them that, look, this is false and this is not. It is the job of the platform owner themselves, and by them using things that do not necessarily work for medical misinformation, and using stuff from other types of misinformation like the politics and all the other types of misinformation, programs like artificial intelligence and natural language processing to identify text-based or audio-based misinformation, to dump the same model into medical misinformation. I think that's a problem, because those models do not work necessarily for medical misinformation. You need to find new solutions, better solutions specifically tailored to what is going to work for medical related misinformation. And it's been there before the pandemic. It will there even after the pandemic finishes, and who knows, there will be another similar problem arising in the future. So I think the need is to have a long-term sustainable tailor-made solution, and incorporating everybody, including fact checkers, scientists, editors of the journals, to get information from them and consolidate the information to generate a model, and not just rely on artificial intelligence or automated models. The second thing is that it is important to call out amplified people. People who amplify this information on social media and in your peer groups, because then they know that they cannot just get away with saying anything. And that includes everybody who has a louder voice, whether it's politicians, whether it's journalists, whether it's just your regular social media kind of big account. So influencer, as they call them. So yeah, I think it's important to call them out, and not in a hostile way, just for the sake of good information and good science. Okay. So I would limit myself to that.
Yeah, many thanks. So Rosamund, back to you again.
Yes, so we have one of our audience who's asking, more medical papers are including an interpretation section. Is this the way forward? Should medical journals publish press-friendly summaries? And of course, we've talked about that space between the scientist and the general public. Would plain language summaries actually help?
I think that's a good question. So I asked Dr. Jaya to go first, and with your permission, Rosamund, I take also a bit of that response as well. Jaya, please.
Plain language summaries, I just love those because very used to sort of taking their help when training journalists from the Cochrane website. And the thing is, they have to be written by people who know what they're writing about, and make sure that they capture the spirit and the fact and the intent and the actual outcomes really well. And that's no easy task. So I think this translational aspect of science is something that's really a key area. And I'd like to flag up just two things. One is the regulatory part and the oversight part. I think the WHO probably has a huge role to play there. And this relates to what we're doing with the plain language summary in terms of often the plain language summary just erases those, rough edges, those fuzzy edges of uncertainty beyond belief sometimes. And I think it's important to take COVID-19 as an opportunity to tell the public and to tell the media as well that uncertainty is one of the strengths of science. And that's how science works. And it's nothing to be ashamed of. The language of uncertainty of science, the middle.
We have disruption. So do you have this? Do you see the same thing? I cannot hear Jaya anymore.
Neither.
Oh, okay. So I take over a bit while Jaya is joining us. So I would like to add a couple of points, examples. So there is some example of that in the process. So for example, the Cochrane collaboration for Cochrane systematic reviews, they do plain summaries for the systematic reviews. But then there is a challenge in the sort of journals business. So Phil explained, most academic journals are low resource settings. So and doing a plain language summary, you probably need an editor who can do plain language writing, which is not an easy thing. So we need to think of that process. The other thing I would add, again, many journals, they have something they call what does it add for policymaker? What does it add for researcher? And that's usually a more simplified message here, summarizing the point for the audience. And the third thing I would add is that we should also learn it's very rare that a single research will give you a message that you can be confident about for the next decision. So usually an accumulation of science that helps you to do that. And that also transferring that issue to the messaging and then doing more. That's something WHO can do more and is doing a lot of that. I mean, preparing, for example, policy briefs, sort of policy advice that brings certain, different levels of science together to get to that point. Okay, I think we lost Jaya, unfortunately. So handing over to you, Rosamond. Probably we have time for one more question. Jaya, we lost you for a few minutes, so we are now moving to the next question that Rosamond is going to read us.
Sure. Well, I think this is a good question to end our panel on in a couple of minutes. How will COVID-19 change research culture? Also, is it going to change the way scientists do their research?
Okay, so would you like to go yourself, Rosamond, to answer this? And then I would ask Phil to follow. Or maybe Phil goes first and you go next.
I'll be very quick, just to say that there will be a greater awareness of the impact of the work they do. Most of the work that scientists have done in the past have been kind of on their own time, in the time it takes in the process, often long and frustrating. Now things, as you've said, all of you are moving much more quickly. And this will change the awareness of researchers of the relevance, but also the impact of their information, including now with the rise of the preprint servers. And they will see that their unpeer-reviewed articles are also being shared publicly and maybe even take more care as they're writing them.
Thank you.
Just a thought, a hope.
Thank you.
Yeah, in a way, nothing is new. It's just everything is amplified and speeded up, and it leads to craziness. I hope we will learn more. I hope the general public will learn more about how science really works, but I'm not sure that's going to happen. We have such challenges. The leader of my country, who has caused so much trouble by misunderstanding of science and using science for political purposes, is just one example. I know this is happening all over the world, and it's very challenging. So I hope, especially as things calm down a little bit over maybe the coming months, we can have a little bit more help from journalists in explaining the scientific process, maybe looking back. Hydroxychloroquine is a great opportunity to look back and say, look what happened. This is how you don't do it, you know. So I hope COVID-19, just by being a more intense version of what we always do with scientific communication, we can have an opportunity to educate about how the process really works and how to build in scientific inquiry and skepticism among the public about how everything works.
Okay, thank you. Yep, I think we got 1 minute left, so I would like to invite everyone for one sentence, final sentence. So Jaya, you go first.
I think Dr. Rosenthal put it very well. I think we should take the COVID-19 as an opportunity in order to prepare audiences to understand how science works and to prepare them, cultivate a scientific temper. And we need to work closely with the media in that space to sort of bridge the gap between science and the media and the public. And the WHO, I suppose, has to take a lead role to see if it can set up structures or ways to regulate this and to plug all those misinformation leakage holes here and there. So all the best. Thank you.
Thank you. Somaya, your one sentence summary.
Yeah, I think pretty much everyone else has talked about it, but if I'd like to add something else would be, I think there'd be better training for science journalists to understand, how and what a research entails, and what are the specific processes around research to actually make inquiry-based analysis of the paper published, instead of just reporting the paper as it is, asking the right kind of questions in the news. And I think that's where people like Dr. Jaya come into the picture. She's been doing some teaching to some journalists, but training journalists in the right way, having more collaborations across journalists and scientists, and not just to promote scientists' own work, because scientists often publish in high-impact journals, and then that's the time they speak to journalists. But that shouldn't be the case. They should actually be in touch most of the times and give their expertise on and off, and actually create policy for in the universities and hospitals to enable more scientists come forward and do public speaking, and be able to interact with more people and discuss what is important for that specific moment, such as this.
Yeah, many thanks. So Phil, only one sentence, please, because we are over time.
I notice everyone's breaking the one sentence rule, but I'll say we all are like that. But as both a scientist and an editor, I can tell you that the people who produce the scientific information really appreciate the opportunity to communicate with the public. That makes what we do more satisfying. So I just encourage you, journalists, to reach out to scientists. I think in general, you'll find them very receptive to short conversations to help communicate what we do. And I think more communication between scientists and journalists will improve our situation.
Thank you. And Rosamund, your sentence?
Thank you. My sentence is, as scientists and public health professionals, we have a collective responsibility to be aware of the risks associated with our research, as well as the benefits, and to contribute to the solution and finding ways to mitigate that risk and improve the quality of good information out there.
Yep, and I would like to keep the sort of that level of the issue of collaboration Rosamund raised as the final sentence. And I say thank you to the audience, to the summit, and to the excellent panelists. Many, many thanks for your contribution to the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you to the organizers. Thank you.